At least in this family, there's one daughter who actually turned out right. My mother said it exactly like that, standing in the middle of Aunt Connie's living room during my sister Paige's engagement party, one hand wrapped around a glass of Chardonnay, the other draped over Paige's shoulder like she was presenting a trophy she'd spent 37 years polishing. 22 people in that room, 22 relatives who went quiet at exactly the same moment, every pair of eyes pulling toward me the way iron filings pull toward a magnet. I was standing near the kitchen doorway with a cup of sparkling water I hadn't touched, still wearing the blazer I'd driven 4 hours in because I hadn't had time to change. My mother looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that doesn't match the room. Not with anger. With the mild disappointment of someone who'd long ago accepted a permanent imperfection and learned to work around it. 34 years old, no ring. Spends her whole life chasing some government job that doesn't even pay well. She tilted her head, voice dropping into that particular register, patient and pitying, the tone of a woman delivering obvious facts to someone too proud to face them. Isn't that right, Evie? 22 people laughed. Not nervous laughter, permission laughter. The kind that only happens when the person with the most authority in the room fires first and everyone else falls in line because it's safer to smile than to stand still. My name is Evelyn Cross. People who know me call me Evie. The ones who actually know me call me Nightfall. I didn't move. Didn't set down my cup, didn't straighten up, didn't blink. I looked straight at my mother across the room, past the pearl earrings, past the second glass of wine, past 34 years of her having decided, early and finally, which daughter was worth the investment. And I said one word, Nightfall. Across the room, near the buffet table my aunt had spent 2 days preparing, a man went still, 61 years old, former DEA special agent, 26 years in the field, a man who'd worked cartel interdiction in Nogales and Laredo without flinching, who had the kind of stillness that only comes from having been in rooms where the wrong movement gets people killed. His name was Roy Sutter, and he was Paige's future father-in-law, and he had just gone the color of old chalk. His plate tipped in his hand. He caught it, barely, and set it down on the table with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He turned and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a stranger's face before, like he was looking at a ghost he'd already written a report about. Quiet down. His voice came out low and scraped, the way voices sound when the body hasn't caught up to the shock yet. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the room. Everybody just quiet down. He exhaled once, slow like a man recalibrating. Because I know who that is. The laughter stopped where it stood. But before I tell you why, a man who spent 2 decades tracking the most dangerous networks on the continent went pale at a single word out of my mouth, and who in that room paid the price they'd been deferring for 34 years, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next, no one in that living room was ready for. Not Paige, not my mother, not me. Roy set both hands flat on the buffet table and turned to face my mother fully, the way a man turns when he's decided a conversation is no longer optional. He didn't ask permission. He reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and removed a folded piece of paper, the kind of paper that gets folded and unfolded so many times it goes soft at the creases. He laid it on the table and smoothed it flat. It was a Department of Justice commendation letter. The name on it had been redacted. The operational designation had not. Operation Nightfall, December 2019, critical intelligence support leading to the interdiction of a transnational trafficking network operating across 4 southwestern states. Assets recovered. 23. Network dismantled. Confirmed. He'd been one of the field agents on that operation. He'd been in the room when the briefing came down from the analyst who'd spent 16 months building the case from the inside. He hadn't known her name then. He knew her code name. I didn't speak. I lifted my sparkling water and set it back on the counter in the exact spot it had already left a ring. The room was doing what rooms do when something tips over without spilling. Everyone waiting to find out what had actually broken. My eyes weren't on Roy, they were on the room, 22 people. I was reading the exits the way I always read exits. Who was already reaching for their phone? Who was glancing at my mother for instructions on how to feel? My cousin Brent, who'd laughed the loudest, was now studying the carpet like it contained information he urgently needed. Paige had her champagne flute tilted at an angle, not drinking, just holding it like a prop she'd forgotten she was holding. My mother recovered the way she always recovered. Smooth, unhurried, like someone who had spent decades in rooms where her version of events was the only version that left. Her voice shifted into the warm, patient register she reserved for correcting misunderstandings in public. Roy, honey, that's very sweet. Evelyn has always had a tendency to, she paused, chose the word carefully, embellish. Even as a little girl, she lived in her own world. We love her for it, of course. A few people smiled. Relief. The room releasing a breath it had been holding. Paige stepped in with the timing of someone who'd been playing this particular role since childhood. She touched my arm with 2 fingers, eyes just soft enough to pass as concerned. Are you doing okay, Evie? You look exhausted. This must be a lot with the drive and everything. I recognized the move, not a question. A reframe. The question repositioned me from someone Roy Sutter had just looked at like a field commander to someone who needed to sit down and drink some water. Not capable, fragile, not decorated, overwhelmed. The sister who couldn't handle things, the sister who needed to be checked on. Gaslighting performed so smoothly that the audience didn't see the knife, only the concern. I set my cup down. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. I walked across the room to Roy and I extended my hand. Firm, direct, eye to eye. Thank you for being here, Agent Sutter. Just enough for anyone paying attention to notice I knew his title. I had always known. Roy shook my hand once, and then he leaned close enough that only I could hear him. Cole Hargrove. He spoke the name the way you speak a warning. He's being given a commendation next Friday. FBI Field Office, downtown Phoenix. For 20 years of distinguished service. I looked at Roy for one full second. I nodded. I didn't go back inside after the party started up again. I sat in my car in my aunt's driveway, engine off, hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, engine ticking as Arizona night cooled around me. I'd driven past the spot on I-10 where this whole thing had started without thinking about it. The way you stop thinking about old wounds until someone presses on them, and the muscle memory of pain comes back in a single second. On the passenger seat was a manila envelope I'd brought from home for reasons I hadn't fully explained to myself. Inside it was a photograph. Me, age 12, at my mother's kitchen table on the morning of the regional science fair. I'm holding up the project I'd built from scratch over 6 weeks, a water filtration model I'd spent every weekend on, and I'm looking at the camera like I'm waiting for something that hasn't arrived yet. My mother's hand is visible at the edge of the frame, but her body isn't there. She'd stepped out of the shot before it was taken. The following weekend, Paige placed first in her dance recital. My mother framed the photograph. The memories came out of order, they always do. The year I got into the accelerated program at my high school, my mother forgot to tell anyone. The year Paige made the varsity cheer squad, my mother organized a dinner for 11 people and had it catered. The year I was accepted to the graduate program at Georgetown on a merit scholarship, my mother said, well, Washington's a long way away. The year Paige got a promotion at the real estate firm where our uncle had gotten her hired, my mother posted a paragraph on Facebook. My daughter, my heart, so proud. Not twice, not 3 times, not a pattern with exceptions. A system maintained with the precision of something that had never been reconsidered. The sharpest memory lived in my junior year of high school. I came home and told my mother I wanted to work for the government someday. Intelligence, federal law enforcement, something that mattered at scale. She didn't argue, she got patient with me. That particular patience, quiet and settled, like a doctor who has already reviewed the test results and is now deciding how to phrase the news. Evie, she said, that kind of work is for people with very specific profiles. Not everyone is built for it. That's okay. You have other strengths. It wasn't cruelty. It was a verdict delivered without a trial, in a voice too gentle to challenge. You're not the kind of person this door opens for. The door had already been measured, and I wasn't the right size. Paige was at the counter making a smoothie and didn't turn around. That was the first time I understood with exact clarity that my mother hadn't just doubted me. She had decided, before I was old enough to have done anything that could have proven her wrong, that this particular daughter operated in a smaller world. The decision had been made once and reinforced across every subsequent year with the quiet consistency of someone who had never questioned whether they might be wrong. I put the photograph back in the envelope, didn't throw it away, kept it the way you keep documentation that might be useful later. There's a phrase I wrote in the first notebook I carried into my first field training rotation. It came from something a senior analyst told me during orientation. The intelligence you gather in silence is worth more than the argument you win in public. I'd spent 11 years living inside that sentence. Every case I worked, every network I mapped, every briefing I built from 16 months of cultivated sources and pattern analysis was an answer that didn't need me to raise my voice to deliver it. But after the word Nightfall had left my mouth in my aunt's living room, and Roy had leaned close and said Cole Hargrove's name, something rearranged itself. Not inside me, around me. The silence I'd maintained for 11 years had kept me protected. Now it was about to end. I needed to tell you something about Hargrove first, because without it, nothing that came next would make the kind of sense it needed to make. Summer 2019. I was 30 months into an undercover analytical role that I cannot describe in operational detail, working a case that had started as a regional trafficking investigation in Tucson and expanded into something no one had predicted, a network moving people, documents, and money across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Nevada, with political protection reaching into 2 state governments and 1 federal agency. 16 months of work, 41 sources. A case file that, when it went to my supervisor, should have been the foundation for the largest interdiction operation the agency had coordinated in the Southwest in 20 years. My supervisor was Cole Hargrove. Deputy Section Chief. 18 years in, positioned for a regional directorship, a man who had the comfortable confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades making decisions that benefited from never being questioned. When I brought him the completed case file, he sat across from me with the file open on his desk and told me, in a tone that was almost kind, that the case had significant gaps in the sourcing methodology that would need to be addressed before any operational phase could begin. There were no gaps. I knew that the way I know my own handwriting. He spent the next 8 months directing me to rebuild analysis that didn't need rebuilding, pushing the operational window, making requests that had no analytical purpose but served one bureaucratic purpose very well. They kept the case inside his section, under his authority, progressing on his timeline, in a direction that would eventually bear his name when it reached the commendation stage. I went around him, not recklessly. Carefully, methodically, the way you move through terrain you can't fully see by mapping it 1 square foot at a time. I delivered the sourcing package directly to the Interagency Task Force Coordinator. I documented every request Hargrove had made and every analytical record showing those requests had no basis. I built a parallel briefing and got it to the right desk through a channel that didn't run through Hargrove's office. Operation Nightfall launched in December 2019. 23 people came home, the network came down. Roy Sutter's team was one of the 4 field units that executed the warrants. Within 30 days, Hargrove filed a formal complaint against me. Improper coordination channels, unauthorized information sharing, insubordination. The words were chosen to make it sound like I was the liability, not the bottleneck, not the man who had sat on a finished case for 8 months because the credit wasn't properly arranged yet. A memo went out to the section. Evelyn Cross had circumvented proper protocols. The review was framed to protect the institution, which meant it was framed to protect Hargrove. I called home. The only time in my adult life I have ever cried on the phone to my mother. Not as an analyst or a federal employee or a daughter who had spent 11 years building something worth building. As a 32-year-old woman sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in Phoenix with a formal complaint against her name, asking the woman who raised her to say 3 words. I believe you. I told her everything. The case, the timeline, the 8 months of deliberate obstruction, the 23 people, the complaint, the memo. I told her all of it, every part of it, and I heard her breathing on the other end of the line. And for a few seconds, I thought that maybe this was the call that broke through, that the sound of your child crying in a hotel room 600 miles from home was the sound that overrode everything else. She waited for me to finish. Then she said, I told you that world wasn't for you, Evelyn. Some people learn the hard way. Then she hung up, no pause, no goodbye, just the flat, disconnected silence of a line that had been there and then wasn't. I held the phone for 10 seconds. The clock on the nightstand made it easy to count. Then I put it down and sat in the dark for a while. 3 weeks later, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize at first. Then I placed it. A colleague I'd worked with briefly the year before, someone Hargrove had championed for a promotion that my work had made possible. The text said he'd seen the complaint memo and wanted me to know he thought it was handled correctly. He hoped I'd learn to work within established channels in the future. He'd been briefed using my analysis. He knew whose work had built that case. He sent that text anyway. The walls go down faster than you expect and with less warning. The person who held the line was my former training supervisor, a woman named Judith Crane, who had moved into a senior advisory role at the interagency level. She didn't offer comfort. She offered something more useful. A quiet transfer into a research and analysis position that removed my name from anything Hargrove could touch. A position description, designed to make me invisible to anyone who might be looking for the analyst, who'd gone outside her chain of command, and something else. A reason to wait. You don't win this today. She told me in a conference room with the blinds half closed. You win it when the record is complete and the right people have read it. Go be so good at this that when the moment comes, there's no argument left to make. That's not advice. That's an assignment. Are we clear? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, good. Now go be invisible and be exceptional at it. I opened my eyes in the car outside Aunt Connie's house. 5 years had passed since the hotel in Phoenix. 1900 days since my mother had told me I'd learned the hard way, and she had not once, not at Thanksgiving, not on my birthday, not in a single text or phone call in 5 years, asked how any of it had resolved. Not the complaint, not the transfer, not the nights when I had to make the decision to stay in the work, hour by hour, the way you breathe when the air is thin, not automatically, on purpose every time. But Roy Sutter had kept that commendation letter. Judith Crane had kept her word. And next Friday, Cole Hargrove was going to stand on a stage in a federal building and accept a commendation for 20 years of distinguished service. And one of those years would be 2019. The engagement party crowd had scattered in the way of people who need to not know what they just witnessed. My mother had gone inside without looking at me again. Aunt Connie stood in the doorway for a moment and met Roy's eyes and gave him a nod that carried more information than most conversations do. I was reaching for my keys when Roy followed me out to the driveway. He didn't ask if I wanted company. He just fell into step the way someone walks beside someone when they know the terrain. He stopped at a distance that gave me room to leave if I needed to. "You don't have to hear this," he started. "I just want you to know one thing." He held out the commendation letter, still folded along those worn creases. The first time I saw a document that mentioned Operation Nightfall, he said the analyst's identity was redacted. But the methodology was unlike anything I'd read in 20 years. I cut that section out of the briefing file and kept it because I wanted to know who had built it. Took me 3 years. I looked at the letter, my hands were steady, it took me a few seconds before I could look up. Why? Investigator's voice. Not gratitude. Roy exhaled a short, quiet sound. Because when those warrants executed and 23 people came out of those locations alive, I asked myself, where is the person who built this? Does anyone in this government know what she actually did? He paused. The answer was no. So I decided that at least one person should keep the record. Something settled in my chest. Not relief exactly, recognition. While my mother was telling relatives I was chasing a government job that didn't pay well, while my former colleague was sending texts about proper channels, while Hargrove was maneuvering himself toward a commendation, a field agent I had never met was quietly maintaining a record that no one had asked him to keep. Hargrove's event is Friday night. Roy shifted into operational tone. 7 o'clock. FBI Phoenix Field Office, Main Conference Center. The commendation is from the director's office. They'll have bureau staff, media, probably a few state officials. He pressed the letter into my hand. The file is yours now. The record of what actually happened. I sat in the car, put the letter on the passenger seat, stared at it for a long moment. Then I reached for my phone and called a number I hadn't dialed in months. Judith Crane picked up on the second ring, like she'd been expecting it. "I heard Hargrove is in Phoenix Friday," I said, and kept my voice flat. A pause. "Then the Nightfall documentation was partially cleared last quarter, not publicized. I have certified copies of the original case file, the sourcing package, the internal routing records showing the timeline of Hargrove's obstruction, and his formal complaint against you." 10 seconds of silence between us. "Will you be there Friday?" she said. "I already have a badge." I put the phone down. Looked at the letter on the passenger seat. The Arizona night outside the car windows was very clear and very still. I was in the driveway, hand on the door handle, when my mother appeared from the side of the house. Moving the way she moved when she needed to intercept something before it developed, carrying a container of leftover desserts from the party table, wrapped in plastic wrap with the carefulness of a woman who understood the power of domestic gesture. This was her oldest language. When logic failed, when denial had no traction left, when nothing else could re-establish the arrangement, she brought food. Evie. Her voice had changed completely. The sharp edges filed smooth and replaced by the worried, softened tone of a mother who was concerned. "Have you eaten? Let me give you these to take for the drive." I looked at the container, little glazed lemon cakes. She made them every year for Paige's birthday. I had counted the years, 34 of them. Not once had she made them for mine. "I'm fine," I said, voice flat and level. She didn't leave. Couldn't leave, because leaving would mean accepting that the lemon cakes hadn't repaired anything. "That was Roy Sutter," she said, and her voice settled into the instructional patience she used when explaining things to people who needed guidance. "He's a lovely man, but he's been retired for years. Sometimes they get these old cases mixed up. I'm not saying he's lying, I'm saying his memory might not have all the details quite right." From behind her, Paige materialized. Phone in hand, eyes not on the screen, a position that had been arranged to look accidental. She touched my arm again with the same 2 fingers, same placement as before. "We're just worried about you, is all. You always carry everything alone. You don't have to do that. We're your family." I heard the architecture under the concern. The message inside the message. Come back under the arrangement. Stop being a variable. Stop making this room shift in ways we can't control. We love you. Now stop. I looked at my sister, held her eyes for one measured second, the length of time it takes to let someone know you have read every page of the script they're performing. "Mom, Paige." I placed my hand flat on the car door, voice level and edged with just enough weight to land. "I'm not going to argue tonight, not because I don't have anything to say, because what I need to say isn't meant for a driveway." My mother started to speak, I continued, before she could find the first word. "Roy doesn't misremember, and I'm not someone who needs to be managed, but tonight isn't when you'll understand that." I got in, started the engine, didn't look in the rearview mirror. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Friday. Phoenix. Hargrove would stand at a podium and be given something built on the back of what I had done and what he had suppressed. For the first time all evening, the corner of my mouth moved. Not a smile, the reflex of someone about to walk into a room where the calculus is about to change. Midnight. The small lamp on my kitchen table. My work journal, the one I'd started the week before field training, lay open on the table in front of me, pages worn at the corners from 11 years of handling. I didn't need to read what I'd written, but that night I needed to see the words with my eyes. Every network has a node that doesn't know it's load-bearing. Your job is to find it before anyone else does, and to document it so thoroughly that when the moment comes, the case stands on its own. I had written that during my first year. I had lived inside it for 11 years. Every case, every network, every briefing built from months of silence and methodical work was that principle expressed in action. Tonight it carried a different weight, not about a trafficking network in the desert, about a man in a conference center in Phoenix who was about to accept a commendation for work that would not exist without the analyst he'd spent 2 years trying to erase. I closed the journal, walked to my bedroom closet, opened it, and removed the garment bag I hadn't unzipped in 8 months. Inside, my charcoal gray interview suit, the one I wore to formal federal proceedings. I laid each piece across the bed, pressed, sharp, the Department of Justice's service pin on the lapel, the small American flag pin beside it, things I wore when I needed a room to understand something before I spoke. I had never needed a room to understand something more than I needed it Friday. My phone lit up. Judith Crane. I picked up on the first ring. "You need to know the record is complete," she said without preamble. "The sourcing package, the routing logs, the comparative timeline. Everything that shows what the case looked like when you delivered it versus what Hargrove represented to internal review. It's all there, certified and dated, all of it, all of it." She paused. "There are people in that room Friday who have read that file." I laid the phone down, looked at the suit across the bed. Every crease pressed clean, every pin in the right place. The answer that hadn't needed words for 5 years was about to speak at full volume. I changed into sleep clothes. 4 hours, same as before every high-stakes proceeding, alarm set, out before it went off. 5:15 in the morning. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, that particular early light making everything flat and clear, and looked at myself for a long moment. The face looking back was 34 years old. It had spent 11 years building cases that were invisible by design, moving through institutions in the deliberate quiet of someone who understood that the most effective work is the work no one sees until the moment it becomes undeniable. I thought about my mother's words from the engagement party. Chasing some government job that doesn't even pay well. I looked into my own eyes, no anger, no satisfaction, the stillness of someone who had survived the long work and was now standing at the threshold of its completion. I put on the suit, pinned the lapel, Nightfall was ready. If you've ever done the work no one credited you for, stayed in the room when everything told you to leave, and chosen not to make noise because you knew the case had to be airtight before you spoke, hit that like button. So Evie knows her story is reaching you. And if you've had to protect your peace while the wrong person collected your harvest, leave it in the comments. Sometimes just saying it out loud is the first breath you've been able to take in years. FBI Phoenix Field Office. Friday evening. The main conference center, dressed in the particular formality of official recognition events. Small American flags on every table, department seals on the screen at the front of the room, the smell of catered coffee and good intentions on behalf of people who hadn't done the geometry of who deserved what. Judith stood in the back when I arrived. Dark suit, no fanfare, the quiet posture of a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms where she was the most prepared person present and had learned never to announce it. She met my eyes once, nodded once. I took a seat at a table near the center aisle, placed both hands flat on the surface, and waited. Hargrove was near the front with his cluster of department contacts and 2 state officials I recognized. Silver at the temples, the easy bearing of a man who had grown so accustomed to being honored that the ceremony had become indistinguishable from his regular expression. His gaze found me within 90 seconds of my sitting down. The room wasn't that large. The service pin and the flag pin and the way I was sitting, spine straight, hands visible, eyes steady, were not the posture of someone who had come to watch. The color left his face slowly, the way daylight leaves a room, and then he saw the table where Judith was standing, and it left faster. Someone from the Bureau's administrative staff approached me before the program started. "I don't see your name on the registrant list." I looked at him. "I'm not registered. I'm here as a matter of record." He moved away. I noted his direction. Let it go. Hargrove came to my table before the program opened, the way someone approaches a variable they need to control before it has the chance to become a problem. He extended his hand. "Evelyn, good to see you." I looked at his hand, left it extended for 3 full seconds, long enough to be a statement. Long enough to confirm that he had not been misreading the room. "Good enough to remember everything," I said. "All the way back to December 2018, when the case file was complete and the review request sat in your inbox for 6 weeks without acknowledgement." He lowered his hand, turned and walked back toward the program table, but his shoulders were set wrong, tight and elevated, a man who had just confirmed something he'd been hoping to deny. Roy settled into the chair beside me without asking. He'd come after all, civilian clothes. The quiet of someone who had decided to witness something. Your mother and sister are at the back entrance, he said, not lowering his voice. I had seen them when I walked in, 20 minutes ago. My mother standing inside the door in the outfit she wore when she needed to make an assessment, my sister just behind her. They'd followed me to Phoenix. My mother needed to see for herself whether Roy Sutter had been confused, or whether the daughter she had spent 34 years placing at the edge of the frame was actually the person he said she was. Good, I said. They need to see this. The MC opened the program. 20 years of distinguished service. Decisive leadership. Commitment to the mission of the Bureau and the communities it serves. The language of official recognition, assembled from the vocabulary of things that are true in the right light and incomplete in any other. Hargrove took the podium, warm, practiced. The rasp of a man who had delivered remarks often enough to know where to pause. He spoke about dedication, about the complexity of interagency work, about the importance of proper process in high-stakes operations, because without process, he said, and his eyes swept the room in the direction of my table, outcomes become unpredictable. Personnel act outside their lane. The integrity of the case is compromised. Those of us who've spent careers building the right structures, we know what it costs when individuals decide the rules don't apply to them. He looked at my table when he delivered that sentence. He'd walked into the only position he couldn't recover from. A chair moved. The sound was small in the room and absolute. Roy Sutter rose to his feet, one hand on the table's edge, 61 years old and built like a man who had spent 2 decades in the field. I was there. 3 words, no microphone needed. His voice filled the room the way certain voices do, not by volume but by weight. The weight of someone who has no reason to perform, and every reason to tell the truth. 200 people in the room turned toward him. I coordinated with 4 field units on the execution of Operation Nightfall. He didn't raise his voice. He loaded it, the way you load something that doesn't need to be thrown to be dangerous. The case that authorized those warrants was built by one analyst working alone over 16 months. He pointed at me, arm straight, hand steady, this woman. While the officer at that podium held her completed case file in his inbox for 6 weeks and then required her to rebuild analysis that did not need rebuilding. The murmur that came through the room was not quiet. 200 people recalibrating simultaneously produce a specific sound. Hargrove's forehead went slick. He gripped the podium. A woman in a burgundy blazer near the left wall stood up. She identified herself as a former member of the Interagency Coordination Team on Nightfall and said she had personally received the sourcing package and could confirm the timeline of its delivery did not match the timeline Hargrove had represented in the internal review. A man in the second row stood. Gray-hair DOJ lanyard. He said the internal investigation from 2020 had been closed administratively rather than completed analytically, and that 3 months ago he had read the full case documentation for the first time. Then from the fourth row, a woman I had not seen in 5 years stood up. She had been one of the 23, 40 years old, dark hair, the particular stillness of someone who had been through something that reorganized the internal furniture permanently. She didn't introduce herself to the room. She looked at me and said, simply 7 words. She built the case that brought me home. Each testimony landed in the room like something that had been in the air for years and had finally found a surface to rest on. Hargrove backed away from the podium. No script left, no aid materializing with an exit. He was standing in front of 200 people watching the official version of 20 years disassemble itself in real time, and there was no procedural mechanism available for this. There was only the room. Judith Crane rose from the back. No theater. The deliberate movement of a woman who had waited 5 years for the record to be complete enough to speak. The operational documentation for Nightfall was partially declassified 3 months ago, she said, voice level, and reaching every corner, including the original case file, the internal routing logs, and the comparative timeline showing the state of the analysis when it was delivered, versus the characterization of that analysis in the formal complaint filed against the analyst who delivered it. She set a bound report on the table in front of the SMC. The historical record has been entered. Silence, the kind that has weight. The woman in burgundy raised her hand to her brow in a salute, deliberate and still. The DOJ official did the same. Then Roy, then the woman from the fourth row. Then, one by one, row by row, the room rose without a word, not applause, not ceremony. Just 200 people in attention for the truth that had just been said out loud for the first time. I stood, heels together, hand raised. From the far corner of my vision, I saw my mother at the back entrance. One hand pressed to her mouth, the other against the wall, like she needed it for balance. She had seen every word of it, every person who stood, every salute. The record she hadn't believed existed, read in public, by people who had no reason to perform it. Paige was behind her, very still, phone at her side with the screen dark. No caption for this. No way to make this the version of events, where the right people came out right. 3 days later, 10 in the morning, 3 knocks on my front door. Soft and uncertain, the sound of a fist that didn't know whether it had the right to knock. My mother, plain clothes, no jewelry, hair pulled back simply. In her hands, a tin. Lemon cakes, the glazed ones, the birthday recipe she had made for Paige every year of my life without making them once for me. She was holding them in both hands the way you hold something when you've run out of other things to say. I stood in the doorframe. No hurry, Evie. Her voice broke on my name. I didn't know. I looked at her, still as a cleared room. You didn't know or you chose not to ask. She tried to speak. I continued before she found the word. You had my number. Every transfer, every new address, 5 years of them. You had the number because I made sure you had it. You chose not to dial it. You chose a version of me that was easier to hold on to. You chose it over a phone call to your own daughter that would have taken you 4 minutes. She reached for my arm. I stepped back one full step. Nothing dramatic. Just the distance that needed to be there. You're not here because you understand me, I said, and my voice didn't rise. You're here because you're in pain and you need the pain to go away. Those are not the same thing, she cried, full and unchecked, the way people cry when the shame has been compressed for too long and the surface finally gives. She asked me for a chance. Please, Evie, please. I looked at my mother on my front step for a long moment, not with anger, with the clarity of someone who had made this decision across 5 years of quiet thought and was now simply delivering it. Please go home, I said. Don't come back. This isn't punishment. This is me protecting what I have left to protect. I closed the door, the deadbolt turned. One clean, final sound. The following Thursday, Hargrove called my phone and asked to meet. A diner off Camelback, vinyl booths, coffee that had been sitting since the previous hour, the kind of place that has no prestige to lend either person, no uniform, no department pin. Just a 63-year-old man in civilian clothes sitting across a table from the analyst he had spent 2 years trying to file away into a drawer. He confessed everything. The 6 weeks the file sat untouched. The requests for revision that had no analytical basis. The anonymous sourcing of the memo that characterized me as a procedural risk. The formal complaint filed the week the operation was publicly commended, timed to ensure my name would carry a question mark when anyone in the department searched for it. He laid it all out the way a person empties their pockets before a long flight, mechanically, without satisfaction, because carrying the inventory had become heavier than putting it down. When he finished, he looked at his coffee cup. Why did you wait so long? He asked. You had the documentation. I looked at him across the table. No anger in the room, just two people and the record between them. Because a case built on resentment has contamination in it, I said. I needed to wait until everything I'd done since you filed that complaint was documented proof that I didn't need to tear you down to stand up. Every case I worked in those 5 years, every briefing, every source I protected, and every person those cases helped. All of it was built while your complaint was still on my file. That record doesn't just clear my name, it makes the argument for me without me having to make it. I paused. Let him sit with that. My existence, still in this work, still decorated, is the sentence you'll carry. Not because I put it there. Because you created the contrast by what you did. You'll have that for the rest of your career. And there's no appeal. I put cash on the table for my coffee. Stood. Walked out into the flat Phoenix afternoon without looking back. 2 weeks after that, Roy called. Not about Hargrove. Not about anything official. Just a quiet voice saying he ran a small Tuesday breakfast group at a Veterans Resource Center in Tempe. Federal and military, mixed, people in transition. People who'd been through things that the standard debrief process wasn't built to hold. Did I want to come? I drove out in civilian clothes. Baseball cap pulled low, the civilian disguise that doesn't fully work and you wear anyway, because the habit of not announcing yourself dies slower than everything else. The room was small, a community center annex, 12 chairs in a circle, a coffee station assembled from whatever someone had donated, a box of grocery store muffins on a folding table. No protocol, no rank displayed. Just people who had been through things sitting in the same room because the alternative was being through things alone. I took the chair with my back to the wall and a full sightline to both doors. I had no plan to speak. Roy had asked, and I had come, and that was the full extent of my preparation. When the group turned to me, I looked around the circle. My eyes stopped on a young woman across from me, mid-20s, shoulders curved forward and in, the posture of someone who had spent a long time making herself smaller than the weight on top of her. Eyes fixed on the floor in front of her feet. I knew that posture in the particular way you know your own handwriting when you find it in an old notebook. She was where I had been in the months after Phoenix. I stood, no notes. The hardest part isn't the work, I started, keeping my voice low. The hardest part is afterward. When you've done everything right and the institution didn't catch up, and you're sitting in a hotel room or a car or a kitchen at midnight, trying to figure out whether the version of yourself that did that work is still in there somewhere. The young woman raised her eyes. I've heard your name, she said. Her voice was thin and careful, like something she was holding very gently. Why do they call you Nightfall? Doesn't that mean the dark? I looked at her. For the first time in that room, and maybe for the first time in longer than I could name, I felt something in my face loosen. Not the controlled expression of someone managing a situation. Not the careful neutral of someone who had spent 11 years keeping her face professionally unreadable. Something that was just true. Nightfall does mean the dark coming, I said. But the way I was taught to think about it, it doesn't mean the dark wins. It means this. No matter how far down in the dark the person I was building a case for had fallen, I was going to build something so solid that the light had to come back up, and I was going to wait as long as the work required. The young woman's face changed. Not dramatically. The way a held breath finally releases. Around the circle, people nodded. The slow, settled nod of people who had carried a true thing for a long time without company, and had just found it said out loud. I sat back down. The work was finished. Driving home through the Phoenix night, windows down, the warm desert air coming in like a hand against the side of your face, I thought about my mother in the Scottsdale house, where the family photographs still covered the hallway wall. Evelyn Cross standing at the very edge of every group shot, placed in the space that was left after everyone else had already arranged themselves. I wondered if she'd moved any of them. I decided it didn't matter. I thought about Hargrove walking into every room for the rest of his career, knowing that 200 people had watched the official version of his legacy become the documented record of what it actually was. I thought about Paige, somewhere tonight, working out how to reframe a story where she had no good position to take. They were all inside hells of their own construction. The hell of a judgment held past every correction point. The hell of power mistaken for the right to decide other people's ceilings. The hell of a family arrangement that required one person to be smaller so the others could feel larger, maintained so long that the arrangement had been mistaken for the truth. But not me. I had built the case. I had waited until the record was complete. I had walked into every version of the dark, the hotel room in Phoenix, the midnight of the formal complaint, the years of invisible excellent work in a file cabinet with a question mark on it, and I had carried myself back out, not because anyone came for me, because I decided every day for 5 years that the work was worth completing, and that I was worth completing it. The quiet in the car wasn't emptiness. It was the particular stillness that settles after the last piece of a long-built case has been entered into evidence, and the room has understood it. The stillness of someone who had spent 11 years being placed at the edge of photographs, where she should have been at the center, and had finally, after all of it, come all the way home. Not to a house, not to a family that had earned the word. Home to the work. Home to herself. Nightfall at last had finished building the case.